Somewhere between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, a species disappeared from the Earth. They had been here for 400,000 years. They buried their dead with flowers. They painted caves. They made jewelry. They cared for their sick and elderly, people who could no longer contribute to survival but were kept alive anyway, which means they had something almost no other animal has ever had: compassion as a conscious choice. They were not our ancestors. They were something else entirely, a different experiment in what intelligence could look like. And then one day, they were gone and we were alone. And the question nobody asks is, what exactly did we lose? Here's what most people get wrong about Neanderthals. We spent most of the 20th century imagining them as lesser, hunched over, grunting, dragging their knuckles through the mud of prehistoric Europe, waiting to be replaced by something smarter. That image was never based on evidence. It was based on assumption, the deeply human assumption that because they are gone and we are here, we must have been better. But the science that has emerged in the last 20 years tells a completely different story, and it is one of the most uncomfortable things modern anthropology has ever had to sit with. Because the more we learn about Neanderthals, the harder it becomes to explain why they disappeared at all. Let's start with what we actually know. Because the real Neanderthal, not the textbook caricature, but the actual species as the evidence describes them, is genuinely extraordinary. Neanderthals first appeared in Europe and Western Asia roughly 400,000 years ago. They evolved separately from the lineage that would eventually produce us. They were not a failed prototype of modern humans. They were a fully developed, highly successful species in their own right, one that survived some of the harshest climate conditions the planet has ever produced, including multiple ice ages that reshaped entire continents. Their bodies were built for cold, shorter limbs to conserve heat, barrel chests with enormous lung capacity, muscles so dense that an average Neanderthal adult was physically stronger than almost any modern human alive today. They were not fragile, they were not struggling, they were perfectly adapted to the world they lived in, and their brains were larger than ours. Not slightly larger, measurably, consistently, significantly larger. The average Neanderthal brain volume was around 1,600 cubic centimeters. The average modern human brain is around 1,350. For most of the 20th century, scientists assumed this didn't matter, that brain size wasn't the same as intelligence, that the Neanderthal brain was organized differently, less efficiently. That assumption is now being challenged from multiple directions simultaneously, because what Neanderthals left behind doesn't look like the work of a less intelligent species. In 2018, a team of researchers dated cave paintings in 3 separate sites in Spain. The paintings were geometric: dots, lines, ladders, hand stencils, and the dates came back at 65,000 years old. Modern humans did not arrive in Europe until 45,000 years ago. The artists were Neanderthals. This single finding demolished one of the most foundational assumptions in paleoanthropology. That symbolic thought, the ability to create art that represents something beyond itself, was uniquely human. It was not. Neanderthals were painting caves 20,000 years before we even arrived on the continent, and art was not all they were doing. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal sites containing eagle talons with cut marks, evidence they were deliberately removing the talons to make jewelry 130,000 years ago. They have found evidence of ochre and manganese dioxide being processed, the raw materials for body paint. They have found perforated shells that could only have been used as personal ornaments. These are not the behaviors of an animal. These are the behaviors of a species asking the same questions we ask. Who am I? How do I want to be seen? What does it mean to mark yourself as an individual in a group? But perhaps the most quietly devastating piece of evidence is this. Archaeologists excavating Neanderthal sites have found the remains of elderly individuals, people who were blind in one eye, who had lost most of their teeth, who had severe arthritis that would have made them completely unable to hunt or gather food, and yet they lived for years, sometimes decades, in this condition. Someone fed them, someone carried them when they couldn't walk, someone made sure they didn't die from the injury or the illness that would otherwise have killed them in days. These people survived because their community chose to keep them alive, not because it was efficient, not because they had something to offer, but because they mattered. That is not primitive behavior. That is one of the most human things I've ever heard. So if they were intelligent, artistic, socially complex, physically powerful, and perfectly adapted to their environment, why aren't they here? This is the question that has haunted paleoanthropology for decades, and the honest answer is that we don't fully know, but the leading theories are deeply uncomfortable, especially for us. The first possibility is climate. Between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, Europe experienced a period of dramatic climate instability. Temperatures swung wildly. Environments changed faster than populations could adapt. Neanderthal groups were already small and spread across vast territories. The argument is that this instability fragmented their populations until they were too isolated to recover. But here's the problem with that theory. Neanderthals had survived ice ages before, multiple ones, conditions that were, in some respects, far worse than what they faced in their final millennia. Climate alone does not convincingly explain the timing. The second possibility is us. Modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 15,000 years ago. Within 15,000 years, a geological blink, Neanderthals were gone. The overlap is difficult to ignore, and while there is no direct evidence of large-scale violence between the two species, there doesn't need to be. We didn't have to fight them to destroy them. We simply had to be slightly more efficient, slightly better at tracking, slightly better at long-distance trade networks that let us share information and technology across vast distances, slightly better at the kind of social coordination that lets a group of 100 people function like a single organism. And that slight edge, compounded across thousands of years and thousands of interactions, may have been enough, not through conquest, through competition so quiet it left almost no trace in the archaeological record. But here's the third possibility, the one that changes everything. We didn't replace them at all, because between 1 and 4% of the DNA of every non-African person alive today is Neanderthal. They are not gone, they are inside us. Their genes influence our immune systems. Some Neanderthal genetic variants help modern humans fight certain viruses. Others affect how our blood clots, how our skin responds to sunlight, how prone we are to certain diseases. Neanderthals did not vanish. They were absorbed. Slowly, over thousands of years of contact, the boundaries between the two populations blurred. Children were born who were neither fully one thing nor the other. And gradually, the Neanderthal genome was diluted into ours, preserved in fragments scattered across billions of living people, still doing its quiet work inside cells that have no idea what they carry. The species didn't end, it merged. So now ask the real question. What if the dilution never happened? What if Neanderthal populations had been large enough, connected enough, resilient enough to survive alongside us, not as a disappearing minority, but as a fully intact, thriving parallel species? What would the world look like right now if there were two kinds of people? The first answer that comes to mind is conflict, and history suggests that's not wrong. Modern humans have never been particularly good at sharing the planet with anything that resembles us but isn't us. The history of our species is not a history of peaceful coexistence with difference, but step past that, because there is another possibility. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, willingly, repeatedly, across thousands of years and multiple continents. Whatever differences existed between us, whatever social, cultural, cognitive gaps separated the two species, they were not so great that the two groups couldn't recognize each other as something worth connecting with. They looked at us, and they saw people. We looked at them. And at least sometimes, in the moments that produced the children whose DNA we still carry, we saw people too. If Neanderthals had survived, we would not be alone in the way that we are. We would share the planet with another species that buried its dead, that made art, that cared for its elderly, that asked questions about the world and tried to answer them with paint and stone and ochre. We would have a mirror, not a perfect one, not a comfortable one, but a mirror that showed us that intelligence is not one thing, that consciousness is not one shape, that the particular way human minds work, our language, our abstract thinking, our obsessive need to explain everything, is not the only way a mind can be. We would know beyond any possible doubt that we are not the measure of all things. That might have changed everything about how we treat each other, or it might have changed nothing at all. Here's what I keep thinking about when I consider all of this. Somewhere in Europe, between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, the last Neanderthal died. We don't know where, we don't know exactly when. We don't know if they were alone or surrounded by others. We don't know if they had a name for what they were, the way we have a name for what we are. What we know is that they were the last of something, the last individual of a species that had existed for 400,000 years, that had survived ice ages and predators and everything the planet threw at them, that had painted caves and buried their dead with flowers and kept their elderly alive because they couldn't bear not to. And then they were gone. And we, the species that was there when it happened, the species whose arrival preceded their disappearance by exactly the wrong amount of time, we spent 150 years drawing them as monsters. Maybe that says more about us than it does about them. The Neanderthals are gone, but they are not entirely gone. They are in your blood right now. A few percent of something ancient carried forward in a species that doesn't fully understand what it inherited or what it cost. We are not what remained after they disappeared. We are, in some small and permanent way, what they became.